Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing disinformation, fake news, etc. There has been research carried out by an organization called the EU Disinfo Lab into disinformation on the part of Indian entities in what can only really be called a campaign of anti-Pakistan propaganda, if that is the right term to use here. Hundreds of fake news websites and NGOs linked to Indian entities, as I said, spread this sort of incorrect news against Pakistan internationally, and this has had an effect. It's affected seemingly policies in places like Europe as well as elsewhere, even at the United Nations at times. Now, according to the EU Disinfo Lab itself, this is the largest network it has ever exposed ever since it came into existence. What does this say, of course, about just the fight around the world, certainly that we're all in the middle of vis-a-vis fake news, and of course just on the part of the Indian government as well? What does it say, if it is of course responsible, though there hasn't been a direct link right now made to the state itself? What does it say that this sort of thing would even originate from their vis-a-vis fake news and disinformation? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Dr. Athena Karazulyani, who is a professor of media and communication at the University of Leicester. She's joining us from Leicester itself. Athena, thank you very much for taking your time out of your busy schedule to speak to us this Saturday. What do you make of this sort of research? It's massive, this sort of a campaign of disinformation.
I think that what you have here is a substantial demonstration. In a way, they've mapped, gone through domain names and investigating how these fake organizations, NGOs, dead significant individuals in the human rights, fake journalists, they have set up a whole infrastructure and whole architecture of disinformation to target individuals, to target the Human Rights Council, to target MEPs towards anti-Pakistani, slander in Pakistan primarily. And I don't think that the target was just influencing members of the European Parliament. I think that the overall, the target is to create by using other local fake outlets, because what is going on here, they have used 500 other, like they propagated fake accounts to influence also the Indian population through this, right? So to target the Indian population through this as well. So these disinformation tactics are, let's say, the new battleground, especially in the last 5 years. You have seen that all countries engage in a way in this kind of information warfare, right? So it is the new game in town, especially since the 2016 US elections, where we saw that disinformation campaigns played a role there as well.
I mean, obviously, certainly it's irresponsible of anybody who gets involved in this sort of thing. But as you said, it's probably fairly widespread, at least for those who have not yet been caught, that is. But in this case, this sort of disinformation is caught. How hard is it actually? Because, for a lot of us who are journalists, and yourself who is a researcher and expert in this, we know the signs of fake news versus real news, right? But how does one, as a layperson even, do you think, try to verify, or how can they verify if information is true or not, especially when it comes to very sensitive topics, right, between quote-unquote enemy states, be it between, for example, anti-Pakistan propaganda by an Indian entity, for example?
I think that just to clarify, that disinformation is propagated by actors that organize distorted versions, they copy paste from other places, real information, they present it in a different way. There's different modes and types of disinformation, but it is intentionally propagated by actors. Sometimes they work for PR companies, they're freelancers, sometimes it's just students, taking some money to do this. But this disinformation is intentional. People do know what they're doing, and they're doing it in a target way on behalf of of a government or a private enterprise, a dark force, let's say. Now, the people that are actually then reproducing this information, this is misinformation because they might be doing so unknowingly. Right. So the problem is that some of this disinformation intentionally placed there and planted is then shared repeatedly and propagated by people that don't know it is disinformation. That is what we call misinformation. And then you have the malinformation, which is hate speech and all sorts of other things like this. So the people, how could they recognize this? It is very difficult. And this is why we have a problem. And also in populations that are not in significant digital infrastructure development and they don't have digital literacy in some respects, it's even more difficult to do something about this. Okay. This is why there is an effort to mitigate this phenomenon by creating what we would say immunization, right? And to use that term, against disinformation by certain practices to support alternative news organizations, to fund fact-checking organizations, independent fact-checking organizations, and so on. And also digital literacy, especially for the new generation of users, and new digital generation, which is a project that I'm working on for European Commission called DigiGen. And this is something we look at how young people participate on digital networks.
On that point, your research, and of course, I'm sure there are others in your team as well as around the world who I'm sure are doing this work, even at the UN level, possibly. Do you think that this sort of thing is a wake-up call then, right? Because these things have very real effects on the ground, right? And they create narratives in people's minds, as you said, who may not have the kind of literacy that the rest of the world may have, and or, as I said, you and I may have, considering we work within this sort of information and field, roughly, of course, on a macro level. Do you think that these international organizations then will now change the way that they sort of accept and or reject information?
I think a greater care has to be given towards how we act on information as well. Right. So when you have this situation where you have 11 MEPs acting and propagating this information from this EU Chronicles organization, disinformation organization, you really have a problem, right? Now, the issue I think here is that even in India, for instance, right, in 2018, you had the disinformation going and misinformation propagating about on WhatsApp about people like people coming to abduct your children, and what you saw there were lynchings connected to that, with WhatsApp having to put posters on the road saying, "Do not believe what you see on WhatsApp," right? So this is not just that you can have perceptions about Pakistan in international forums that are detrimental to Pakistan and influence diplomacy. It is also you can have real events that are influenced in the physical world from what's going on online. So there is a hybrid warfare scenario, right, where what's happening online does not stay online and vice versa. So you have a more hybrid environment, right? So what this disinformation campaigns do count, because they can actually initiate wars, they can initiate people being lynched or dying and so on. So they are serious and significant matters to be doing something about. And I think in the EU Disinfo report, they say something very practical, which is about domains, right? And then how these are given and these are created and so on. But I think there has to be some policy at government level, and already there's a lot of work being done both at the EU and in the UN looking into these issues, and companies such as Facebook, Twitter, Google and so on, are finally waking up to this in the last couple of years in particular, because they're thinking we're not just here to make profit. We have to ensure, right, or sell ads and so on. We have to ensure that this is happening in a healthy public sphere, because it has effects on also, how these companies are promoting disinformation, propagating. And the example, of course, was Facebook being used as a cleansing tool in Southeast Asia and so forth, right?
Indeed. We'll have to leave it there. That is our final word, but we sincerely appreciate your taking your time out of your busy schedule to share your expertise with us. That was a great conversation. That was Athena speaking to us there from Leicester, sharing her expertise with us about, this sort of disinformation. And again, this is massive, hundreds of fake news websites and NGOs. And as Athena said, it wasn't just like these were based in India itself, but were actually domain names, many of them based in Europe or elsewhere, and then propagated and took essentially information that was out there and then twisted it and presented it to people, and this has affected policies seemingly, according to this report. This also has, of course, affected the narratives in people's minds within India itself, also about Pakistan, or possibly even about other topics. And this is all disturbing because, again, as we discussed, all of the above has very real-world consequences, right? It affects the way people think about each other. It affects the way you view the world if you're being given information which has been twisted in a way to suit somebody's specific agenda, hateful agenda. In this case, of course, the Pakistani government has come out very strongly against this, and certainly I would think that the Europeans and others will be very concerned that this sort of thing has happened within their domain, within their sphere, and they will need to then enact reforms and measures to ensure that they do not then become the victim of such disinformation again. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to discuss the United States now and the no-fly list, which has been in place there for a while now, especially, of course, in context of a post-9/11 world. We've had a lot of Muslims, unfortunately, also being placed on the no-fly list, sometimes without proper reasons being given and or proper, at least transparent process as to how exactly they got onto that no-fly list. The U.S. Supreme Court has now ruled that 3 Muslim men, at the very least, can sue several FBI agents who did place them onto a no-fly list because they refused to become informants on their own communities to the U.S. government, the FBI, etc. Certainly, there's a lot to discuss here because, the no-fly lists and just measures that have been brought in ever since 9/11, a lot of them have been very troubling and have specifically only targeted the Muslim American community as well. And there's a lot to discuss there vis-a-vis the freedoms and rights that any, of course, American citizens should enjoy within their country, be it travel or other such issues also. We're joined now by our esteemed guest, Dr. Saeed Khan, who is a senior lecturer at the Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University. He's joining us this morning from Detroit, Michigan. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Dr. Saher Khamis, who is a professor of communication at the University of Maryland. And joining us from Boston, Massachusetts is Dr. Saher Selod, who is an associate professor of sociology at Simmons University. Saher Selod, Saher Khamis, and Saeed, thank you to all 3 of you for your time this morning. Saher Selod, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you make of the no-fly list overall, right? I mean, it's been of concern for the Muslim community for a significant amount of time now.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me. The no-fly list is one list that's being used in airports today. As we saw with this case, there were three Muslim men who were able to successfully fight in the Supreme Court that they have the right to sue the FBI for being placed on this list with no real reason except for that they were asked to be FBI informants. But these lists, the no-fly list is one list. There's another list that I found in my book that I chronicle in my book, Forever Suspect, that it's called the Secondary Security Screening Selection List, known as the selectee list. So in airports since 9/11, TSA has put into place all of these policies, such as the no-fly list, the selectee list, and then practices such as stopping and screening passengers. They say it's random selection, but we know that Muslims are hyper-surveilled in airports visa these lists that have been put into place. I think the big problem is not knowing why or who. There's just a lot of secrecy around how these lists are compiled. Yeah.
And that goes to the crux of the matter, right, Saeed, that there isn't transparency in this process.
There isn't. I mean, as somebody who, well, at least before the COVID pandemic, would fly quite a bit, and over the arc of the last several years since 9/11, seeing the way that the U.S. government has pieced together some kind of policies, it has really been in many ways trial by error. But the two major features of it are, number one, a sense of paranoia when it comes to Muslim Americans, and second of all, the fact that irrespective of the kinds of screening and surveillance policies that have been put into place, they all seem to disproportionately feature Muslim Americans within the line of sight.
Sahar, Khamis, what kind of an effect then does this have on the Muslim community, in your opinion? I mean, this then, do you think discourages people from traveling further, or do you think that the Muslim community has stood strong?
Thank you for having me on the show. It's always a pleasure. I think there's this push and pull mechanism that we can talk about when it comes to the issue of civil liberties and freedom of religion, and also the issue of the ability of certain communities to practice the religion freely and at the same time be able to enjoy all the other civil liberties enjoyed by other American citizens. The Muslim community definitely has been a target in so many different ways. The media has been commenting on this particular case and saying, spy or no fly. In other words, if you don't cooperate with the FBI and do whatever you're told, you can be put on quote unquote the no fly, list, which of course, organizations like CARE, the Council of American Muslim Relations, talked about this issue of being a de facto Muslim registry of people who can be profiled because of the religious orientation and therefore put on this kind of no-fly list. We remember very well after 9/11 how there has been a surge in so-called quote-unquote counter-terrorism laws and acts. You had the Patriot Act, which was basically an act that allowed the government to quote-unquote spy on Muslim citizens, Muslim American citizens, by listening to their private phone conversations and even hacking their emails if needed. And there were groups pushing back against this kind of infringement on civil liberties and saying you cannot do that to American citizens. You have to respect their freedom. So again, we're back to this kind of conversation with a push and pull mechanism, with the government trying to heighten these types of measures on one hand, and then there is a pushback, luckily this time not just from the American Muslim community, but also we saw that in the lower court and in the Supreme Court in a 0-8 vote with the new, of course, Judge Amy Coney Barrett recusing herself from voting on this decision. But we did see a consensus from the rest on the illegality of this kind of action, and even allowing the 3 Muslim men to actually call for compensation in terms of damages.
Saher, Selod, there's one argument to be made, right, if I may be devil's advocate for a moment, about national security, right? In a post-9/11 world, as I put in my introduction, there are always national security concerns. There's always been that argument that we're not targeting a specific community, even though that's fairly obvious, but that we're doing this to keep the homeland safe and all American citizens safe, including the Muslim community. But then on the other side, what confuses me about this case is that's not exactly what this is about, in the sense that these men were placed on this list simply for the fact that they refused to become informants. I mean, what do you make of that detail, and what this then means? What kind of a message is this sending?
Yeah, I think my hope is that because these 3 men were all asked to be informants and then found themselves on the no-fly list, it highlights the problems with these lists that are being utilized in airports in the name of national security. So, I mean, I think this really goes to show that there is a real profiling based on religious identity in airports that aren't making the nation more secure. So this case, my hope is that people will start to recognize how we're continuously funding security practices in the United States that aren't essentially making us more secure. So in airports, for example, we can look at, is this really preventing terrorism or another terrorist attack? Where do we see most of the terrorist attacks happening within the United States? And, the Government Office of Accountability has found that, what's happening through these lists, the no-fly list, the selectee list, and these stops and searches in airports, are not actually doing that. But the complaints that they're seeing is that people are feeling like they're being profiled in airports. So we need to question these practices, and I hope that this case will highlight, the inefficiency in these security practices, particularly in airports.
Yeah. Saeed, on that point of whether or not this makes the homeland more secure, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because one would think, and I know this argument's been put forth by experts in the past as well, that if you actually were to make an ally of the Muslim community or any other community, right, that they would be a lot more willing to, in fact, as the Muslim community, I believe, still very much does in the U.S., if there is somebody troubling amongst their midst and they do have, misgivings about them and or suspicions about whether or not they may become violent at some point in the future, that in fact, that makes the process much better, as in working in partnership with communities instead of against them.
Well, ironically, one could say that this is exactly what the FBI was trying to do, was work with the community by trying to elicit informants to then essentially rat on members of the Muslim American community. And if they decided within their constitutional civil liberties rights that they did not want to do so, that in this case they were going to be punished by being placed on a no-fly list. And I think that one of the things we have to consider about this particular case is it really a victory lap for Muslim Americans? There's a lot here in the Supreme Court decision that really didn't come to fruition. Number one, the Supreme Court did not really find a problem with the no-fly list per se. What they did find an issue with was the overreach of individual FBI agents in supposedly bringing vindictive and punitive measures by putting people on the no-fly list because they refuse to comply. And the fact about whether or not these individuals can still be liable for damages is an open question, because they can claim, and the majority opinion author, Justice Clarence Thomas, he alluded to that point, that the doctrine of qualified immunity still might apply for these individuals. So the idea about getting compensation and damages is still an open question. The other issue, which I find to be really fascinating, is the grounds upon which the three plaintiffs sued and that the courts accepted, which was the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. The fact that there was a recognition that these individuals were claiming that their religious freedom rights were violated, the fact that they're objecting to or rejecting being informants, I thought that that was really, really interesting. So to me, this case seems to be less about Muslims, less about the no-fly list, but more about the parameters of this particular law. As we find religious freedom now being leveraged far more in cases involving LGBTQ and the right to refuse service to various people based on religious freedom, I see this as really more of a test case for that.
Saher, Khamis, as someone who's traveled to the U.S. very often with family members and otherwise, there's always, unfortunately, one feels that, especially when coming in from the outside the U.S., you really feel almost like the air changes. And I don't mean to, overstate that situation, but maybe it's just at the back of my mind as well. That sort of narrative, right, where you have all eyes on you because you are the Muslim on the flight and or, in the airport or in that gate area or, at the security checkpoint, etc. That creates a narrative not just in Muslim Americans' minds, I would imagine, but also for the rest of the public. And then that relationship then really is a fairly negative one in the sense that you have negative thoughts about each other, and that can't really help the situation, can it?
Definitely, and it gets a lot worse if you are a Muslim American woman, if you are a Muslim woman wearing the hijab, wearing the Islamic headscarf. There's definitely research from the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding here in the US that shows very high percentages of American Muslim women who actually reported feeling discriminated against when they are at airports. So I want to talk about this issue of travel being really a tool or a mechanism that has been used somehow against Muslims in a double way. In a way, on one hand, you have this kind of mechanism of denying entry, like when you have the Muslim travel ban that was enforced, of course, under the Trump administration. And Biden has actually promised to lift this Muslim travel ban on day one of his presidency. I sincerely hope that he's going to really fulfill this a very important promise to the American Muslim community, because you have 6 Muslim majority country where there is a Muslim travel ban denying, of course, access from these countries. And you can also imagine the very huge impacts resulting from that. And then you have on the other side of the coin the mechanism of the no-fly zone, which Nihad Aoud, the executive director of the CARE, Council of American Islamic Relations, said basically this is like a de facto Muslim registry. He even mentioned 1.2 million Muslims, which is a huge number, placed on this kind of de facto Muslim registry, really giving them no fly, which is very, very big number when you think about the Muslim American community being around 4 to 5 million at most. So it's a huge percentage, a huge number. And that means impacts on them, of course, socially, economically, the reputation, family visits, work, employment. You can imagine the huge and dire consequences. So this card of travel, whether allowing, basically preventing access to the U.S. or preventing travel from outside the U.S. is a very thorny issue. And I sincerely hope that there will be radical changes in this direction, because I totally agree with Dr. Khan that there really is not, in this particular case, some kind of action against this on a religious basis. There is even pushback from the Justice Department, from the Trump administration, using the qualified immunity rule and saying, oh, maybe they were just doing their job. Maybe such a kind of ruling from the Supreme Court is going to discourage other, social security or national security officials from doing their job. And the question is, should they really do their job at the expense of people's religious freedoms and civil liberties? That is the bigger question.
Sarah, Selod, obviously we all know that there is a better way to do all of the above, right? To keep the homeland secure. But these policies have been in place for so long that I wonder, what do you see as the next steps? Is reform, quote unquote, of these policies even possible? Or do they need to be scrapped altogether? And do we need to start from scratch? What makes sense to do now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that gives me somewhat hope is that under the Trump administration, what he did was he was so overt in his actions, and he was so overt in his anti-Muslim sentiments when he was campaigning and registering Muslims and all of this. So when he instituted his first executive order for the travel ban, it wasn't surprising in any way, because these are things that had been done, from Bush to Obama to now Trump. He was inheriting all these laws and policies. What was surprising was that the American public went to airports to protest. So my hope is that when we talk about, policing in the United States and we see people on the street, that we start to think about, surveillance in the United States and how a lot of these laws and policies are put into place in the name of protecting the United States from another terrorist attack, but their implications are far wider than just the Muslim population. We see the militarization of the police. We see surveillance technologies and tools being put at the border. This has a much wider scope, and so the hope is that, and I agree with Dr. Khan too. I mean, no one was saying the no-fly list was a bad policy, or that the policies put into place in airport security abuse civil rights or civil liberties. And in fact, the 3 men here are able to sue if they even, qualified immunity might protect these FBI agents. But the majority of the people on that no-fly list are not citizens. There are other policies in place that do target actual American citizens, like I said, the selectee list. And so we need to start paying attention to all of these policies if we're going to start dismantling them. So I would hope to see that we could start to dismantle, policies like the USA Patriot Act and things that increase the state's ability to surveil citizens, which Muslims are definitely targeted under.
All right, Saeed, I'll give you the final word, and I'm going to put you on the spot. I mean, do you think Biden will be the president? Will this be the White House administration which will change things for the better?
Well, in one word, no. But in a bit of a broader construction on that, I think what you're going to find is the culture of America when it comes to the securitization and the surveillance that Dr. Selod mentioned is still here to stay. And I'm afraid that it's probably going to get a little bit worse. Perhaps not targeting Muslim Americans, but the idea of Americans as a whole. One thing that this case never really addressed was, what about the people who may have been the targets of the informants? What kind of redress do they have? What kind of harm did they suffer as a result of informants coming forth and surveilling the American community, the American Muslim community? I think that there has to be some kind of societal demand that the kinds of surveillance and securitization measures that are taking must have better oversight, must have better transparency. Here, what we find is one branch, the executive branch of government, which has a whole lot of sway, going all the way back to the Bush 43 administration, of being able to designate somebody as an enemy combatant using secret evidence that even the suspect is unable to see. That needs to change. There needs to be better legislative oversight. And at least in this case, we find that the judiciary did have some kind of pushback on it. Unless and until the underlying culture changes in the United States, I'm afraid that whether it's a Biden or a Bernie Sanders or anybody who claims to be a champion of civil liberties, they're still going to be addled by the cultural sentiment that seems to endorse or at least permit this kind of securitization.
Very well. There's a final word. We appreciate Drs. Saeed Khan, Saher, Khamis, and Saher Selod for their time today and for speaking to us. They're from Detroit, Washington, and Boston, respectively, giving us their take on, the U.S. Supreme Court decision that allows these three Muslim men who were initially, the FBI had tried to recruit them to become informants for them on their own communities. They refused, and then they were placed on this no-fly list. As Saher Selod there had mentioned, this is not the only list which is problematic. There is a secondary list also, and it's very important to, have the knowledge of these sorts of things out there for Muslim Americans to certainly know, and for general Americans to also know about what their government is doing in the name of securitization and in the name of trying to protect the homeland, because a lot of these are very counterproductive measures, seemingly. There is no proof, in fact, that a lot of these measures sometimes actually protect the homeland, American citizens, etc. I mean, the fact that even if there is a non-American citizen on one of these lists and has not had a transparent process is in and of itself also troubling, by the way. But for Americans especially, this can also indicate a very slippery road, right? Because if you start targeting one community and the rest of the society remains quiet about that, tomorrow there may very well be another community. And we do not want to head down such a road at all. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. And on this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Lebanon. And we haven't discussed the continuing fallout, of course, from the Beirut explosion for a while now. But there's been a significant development in the investigation into that explosion at the Beirut port, which, as we remember, killed around 200 people. And, of course, was this massive explosion in the country as well. And, of course, ever since that, also there has been continuing ramifications. Distrust of the investigation has been carried out by the Lebanese judiciary. The investigation has now reached a point where now there are charges that have been carried out against the caretaker Prime Minister, Hassan Diab, as well as 3 ex-ministers for criminal neglect over the fact that they knew that this ammonium nitrate was sitting there in the port, and they had even been warned about the fact that it was sitting there and could very well pose a danger to the population and, of course, to the surrounding areas as well. Let's now discuss that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Martin Beck, who is a professor of contemporary Middle East studies at the University of Southern Denmark. He's joining us today from Odense in Denmark. Martin, thank you very much for your time today. This is significant, isn't it, where you have a caretaker prime minister now being held to account seemingly. Does this mean that the right people will be held accountable? Because it's not like it's just Hassan Diab or these 3 former ministers. Ministers and prime ministers have known for many years in Lebanon that this ammonium nitrate was just sitting there.
Exactly. You're just taking the words right out of my mouth, because I mean, it's what is most interesting about this is who has not been summoned. And this is, of course, former Prime Minister Saad Hariri and and he is also the designated future prime minister, and he certainly knew, and he has not been charged over the blast, and that's of course the real problem. What is also interesting is that now, I mean, the reactions of actually the Sunni establishment, and also the reaction to this charge by Hariri himself. Before that incident, now Diab and Hariri were clearly at odds with one another, because Diab was appointed prime minister against the votes of the Sunni, and so but now when he's now, I mean, when now this charge came, Hariri stood in solidarity with Diab out of Sud, and also the Grand Mufti, so the establishment, the Sunni establishment.
So there's almost like, if I may say, Martin, there's almost like loyalty amongst the thieves, right? Where even all these divided parties, even this, this very corrupt, as Lebanese at least call it, sectarian system of governance, which has been problematic and which we know Lebanese have been protesting for a significant amount of time, even before this explosion took place. That it seems that amongst themselves now they've realized that unity amongst them will protect each of them. Do you think that this sort of investigation can possibly break that facade, can possibly break down this barrier towards a better governing system in the country? Is that too far-fetched a goal, do you think?
I think this is very unlikely, unfortunately, because you very rightly so emphasized that this political class as a whole is they have many trouble to agree upon anything and to take decisions. They're very, and everything is contested, and there is a lot of competition inside the political class. But when they are attacked from outside, then they stand together, then they stick together, and this is something. This is a pattern that has developed over, I mean, since the end of the Civil War, and so I don't think that there is a chance with this political class in power to really, I mean, to go with substantial reforms.
The international community is certainly watching this, right? So we've had the French attempts, but then it seems that Macron, as you well know, sort of there was a bit of a hiccup in the middle where at first he was very critical of the ruling class, and then he suddenly sort of changed and was like, okay, no, the investigation seems to be going okay. He said that he trusted the system to a certain extent, of course, even though he is still critical of it. I mean, it's sort of this mixed message on the part of the French. I mean, is that representative of Europe as a whole, do you think, or the Western world and rest of the world? What does the world, do you think, want to happen here?
The world wants to happen. I mean, the Western world. We have to differentiate here, of course. And the Western world clearly wants to support this regime, and they already, I mean, approved that Hariri will be again the next prime minister. Of course, they ask for reforms because in the light of what has happened, I mean, this disastrous development on the ground and this rising poverty and so on, they cannot just they could possibly not claim that everything is all right. But at the end, they don't really really go for demand deep structural change. In the end, the only way to bring Lebanon back on a sustainable path is to abolish the sectarian system with no ifs and buts, and this is not a demand. I mean, a major problem also of the Western policy. This is especially now from the US, USA, that they single out just one segment of the political class. This is Hezbollah. But they are all the same. I mean, this was also the slogan, the slogan of the October, so-called October Revolution 2019, when tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were mobilized, and their slogan was, "All of you means all of you."
Exactly.
And so singling out Hezbollah is obviously, I mean, one of these Western policies.
And that's a very good point, Don Martin. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. We sincerely appreciate your taking your time out of your Saturday and your busy schedule to share your expertise with us. That was Martin Beck speaking to us there from Odense in Denmark, talking about the fact that now the Lebanese caretaker Prime Minister Hassan Diab, as well as 3 ex-ministers, have been charged with criminal neglect. It doesn't go far enough, though, does it? As Martin there laid out, the case for other much higher-ranking politicians in Lebanon to also be charged and to be held to account over what happened in the Beirut Blast, as well as just the entire corruption within the system of governance right now as it exists in Lebanon. It's extremely important. And also then, just to target one party out of this entire system of governance versus holding the entire system and all the parties that uphold it together, even though they may have their differences amongst each other when it comes to them upholding this entire system for the benefit of themselves, they will do that. They are doing that right now. They're ensuring that they themselves remain protected. So that is, of course, the major problem here when it comes to accountability, justice, and a change and actually governing the country towards a better future. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.